In this day and age, it's very, very challenging to be successful without using data to do anything. So first of all, my name is Hizam. I am the Senior VP of Engineering for NewStore. If you're not aware or familiar with NewStore, we provide software as a service or platform as a service for retail brands, retail stores, so that they can unify their online and digital and also their physical presence in one nice little platform. So to simplify what we do is, if you think of going to an Apple store, you would see a bunch of young hipsterish kids walking around with cool t-shirt and helping the customers buy Apple products. We're productizing the entire experience and making it available to any retailer so they can do the similar things. Especially with the COVID right now, it becomes more apparent and clear to the retailers that they need to have technologies and capabilities such as buy online, pick up at store, buy online, pick up curbside, buy online, return at store, and many other functionalities that come along with such platform. So going back to the question, right, experience of how data proved us wrong, there's a lot of different experience. I think one of us also mentioned it earlier. It's almost on a sometimes monthly basis, daily basis. But one of the thing that I found really exciting was maybe 7, 8 years ago in Southeast Asia. I was fortunate enough to be part of the initial team that was building video streaming capabilities in that region. And at that time, nobody was doing that. We didn't have Netflix, we didn't have Disney, we didn't have all the big players around yet. And we took the opportunity and we thought, wow, it's a $1 billion US piracy market, right? So people go to the store, buy this €1, maybe less than €1 CDs and watch content. So let's tap into that market and let's see what can go, right? So we started with data, right? We started with data and we thought, let's bring subscription video in demand because that saw like it was very natural. Let's innovate in that region. And we started to build everything and we started to open it up to the market. But quickly with the data that we collected, we're realizing people are not willing to pay. But they're not willing to pay for the subscription. And we were like puzzled, why? Like it's so cheap. We're making it cheaper than going to a store to buy a DVD, right? Why would people not pay for it? And we quickly realized with this data, it's habit forming. People just don't have the habit of buying something on a subscription. It's just not in the mindset of people in the emerging market. I mean, if you think of the Western world, you buy a subscription for $5 or $3 or €10, you kind of forget, right? You forget about it and it just keeps taking your money, and whether you watch it or not, it just keeps going. So I think that data quickly proved us wrong that that model of subscription video on demand is not going to work in that region. So it forced us to quickly pivot into figuring out, all right, what can we do differently? So that's when we came up with this AWOT model, advertisement-based video on demand. So we made everything free so that people could come now, watch it for free, and then monetize it through advertisement. Again, we got proven wrong by data later, where why are people not watching the content that we're providing? We spend many millions of dollars buying all this Hollywood content, which we thought was amazing and exciting, and people were just not watching them as we would wanted them to. But then we realized with data, the content that are cheap and localized, which costs a fraction of what we paid for the Hollywood content, was getting a lot more people watching them. And from that data, we learned that, okay, Hollywood content does not work because all of us were a bunch of people, Western educated, came from mostly Western countries, and believed that's what we wanted to watch because we were the initial users. We wanted to use it, but from real data, we were proven wrong. The customers don't care about what we wanted to watch. The customers really wanted something different. So we switched, we pivoted, and we started to target the local contents, which were targeted very local, was bringing in a lot more viewers. So I think that is impressive and amazing to see how data could really steer the company into the right direction and really make anybody very, very successful. And I thought maybe I would kind of also steer this conversation to something that also very data related, but oftentimes we talk about data in a way where we are validating the solution, right? We have a solution and we validate it. I wanted to maybe get a little bit more insights from all of you. What do you guys think of validating the problem? What kind of experience do you have in using data to validate the problem, right? This is way before even finding a solution for it, going and building it, and then collecting data to see if it's really working out or not. And it's very well defined and thought through by Eric Ries in the Lean Startup. So I just wanted to see what are your actual experience in that problem validation.
One of the things which I have realized where data plays a very fundamental role before we even move into subsequent stages is in opportunity sizing, is in understanding whether this is an opportunity good enough for the product to build on. Is it a good enough opportunity? Is it a sizable one that the company should follow? And the kind of data needed at this stage is not very clear to many people, like doing, because it is a culmination of different data kinds: internal data, external data, competitive data, and some kind of unstructured data. So how do we actually gather those data points? How do we create a storyline out of that unstructured data? This for me is a very, very critical piece in the product development stage.
Do you have a bit more of a concrete example of how do you gather this data, right? I mean, that would be very interesting.
One of the examples I can give you that OLX, for example, is in the space of second-hand classifieds market. So we buy and sell used goods. And we are trying to look into the future opportunities. What kind of like, do we want to look into refurbished goods also? Do we want to go into, let's say, rental mode also? So these are some of the kind of open-ended questions which we are trying to answer. And we don't really have, let's say, a cookie cutter solution for all of them. So what we are instead doing, we are trying to find out, like, let's say for the refurbished markets, what are the other competitors within our geographies? What are they doing? What kind of demography we have in terms of the Poland, Ukraine, the markets where we are in? What is their price sensitivity like? So these are proxy data sources we are using so that we can figure out what is the potential size of refurbished markets. But we don't have any, I would say, well-established method to do it. We are also looking into Google Trends to find out answer if people on the net are actually looking for refurbished items. Is there a demand for those items in general in these geographies? But it really depends on, I think, problem to problem. And it is more like sometimes it's a breadth first search, sometimes it becomes like a depth first search.
Excellent example. I think we kind of took a bit more of an effort when we were trying to validate the problem. It's funny, I remember we were in this very, very big mall in Malaysia, and the office was one of the office floors in the mall. And we were brainstorming, right? Like, how do we validate this problem? Like, do people actually want to watch, right? So if we called everybody in the office, there were like 15 people at that time. Guys, let's just go out to the mall, stand in the middle of the mall, and just stop random people and ask them, like, would you like to watch something like this, right? We had a mark on the phone, we put it nicely on the phone, and we just kept asking. I mean, it was a clear textbook example of problem validation where you just get out of the office and fake it till you make it kind of deal, right? And does anybody else had any similar experience like that?
I had two examples. The first one is going out and asking people. Also, a long time ago, we had this streaming service, something that today we relate to Spotify just for music and so on. And we were discussing about subscription models because we wanted to know if people were willing to pay, right? And we did every single type of research, from surveys to going out asking people to focus group, and the answer was always yes, of course, this is premium content, I'm going to pay. We rolled out the subscription model and it failed, because even though people were saying, oh, I'm going to do it, at the right moment they're kind of, yeah, maybe tomorrow. So this is one example. A more recent one, it's I was CTO for Wundertext, the tax filing platform in Germany. And at some point we had huge internal debates about what else should be covered in our tool, because the German tax law is really complex or really comprehensive. So we started being a company focusing on students doing their tax declarations, and then we start growing. Right, at some point we had this roadblock that was okay. Most of our happiest users, the most loyal users, are the ones coming from the expat community, right? And they do their first year and they're happy, and they do the second year and they're happy, but we cannot cover every single case, and then we lose some customers. So to try to measure if we had a churn thanks to that, we start adding additional options like, oh, click here if you have cryptocurrencies. And they would click, we would record data and basically say, oh, we still do not have, but we are coming back to you soon. And same thing, oh, you have income from abroad. And we would decide based on that. In the end, we found out that people will not click on any of those, mostly because the type of customer we had at the moment were exactly the ones that wanted to do it quick and fast. They were not willing to optimize for every single case we could support. But it was a really good learning, because I wasn't also against, oh, let's not add an option here, because the moment they click, they're going to be frustrated and probably they're going to drop off. They didn't. So lesson learned, but I really think it's something you should do with live customers from time to time.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of like separate some things, right? One is like data, the other one is your user research. I think you have different tools in your discovery and as well as analysis and validation toolkit. And it's also, I find it interesting. I think the challenges and it's mostly product problem, I think I said, but I think as an engineering leader or a data leader, you're definitely at the forefront of pushing this to the right things, right, and help your teams and people to go there. Is kind of like these things can widely shift and actually have a huge impact on the final solution. Whereas then it goes back to engineering, where you're talking sometimes. A recent example from not recent, it's about 2 years old by now, but a very good example. I was like, we were faced with a decision. So we have a product. It's a medical learning product. So imagine multiple choice questions very simply, and we're talking about like all our competitors as we're going to the US market, where we're going against big players. They've been around since 30 years. They have hundreds of millions of revenues in this part, right? And we're trying to get in there. And every one of them had like a flashcard feature, like memorized learning, kind of like word to effect. You turn around the physical card and you learn it. So predominantly in our companies are like, yeah, we need this feature, no brainer. Let's do it, invest it. We did the rough estimations because also we need content for those flashcards, which is our medical content team. So we're talking, I don't know, half a year, 20, 30 people investment, right? And the user market research, everything was done actually. It was kind of like a thing to do. But where we then like saying, okay, let's look at some data. And we started with pure data, like customer support requests, these kind of things, right? Market research coming out where we want the quantitative level. Then we said, okay, let's try to understand it. So we started talking to the users. So some of our PMs and medical guys flew to our New York office and talked to some of medical students, actually figuring it out. And through this conversation, we reshaped a bit the part. We've actually figured out most of the medical students are using a tool called Anki, which is a flashcard tool, generic one, but it's well adopted in the medical community. And then they came back with this to kind of like the engineering teams and said, hey, Anki is open source. Let's write a plugin. And same there, we just did based on this, we just wrote, was a 2-day effort, like a mini hackathon actually we did in one of the teams, built an Anki plugin, brought it out there. Huge success. We got actually with the core developers Anki and the medical community together to come fly over then afterwards, do a show and everything with us. And think of it as those minimal engineering efforts at the end, right? But the difference between just doing a mixture is starting from some quantitative data triggers to qualitative, to then afterwards doing smoke tests and stuff back to quantitative. We managed a size of the scope, I don't know, let's just say 30 people, half a year, down to 3 people, 3 days. And I think so it's quite a challenge ultimately, which have a huge impact on how you do engineering at the end of the day to really get your products built. And I think it's a really key thing that we should keep also the right skill, I think, for what makes a difference is really knowing those tools and how to apply them the right way to get to those, because that's the order of magnitude, right, that you're ultimately saving in efforts at the end of the day.
That's actually very good. I think the choice of tools and how we use the tool matters a lot, right? I'm curious, like, what is your current like data engineering, like the tool sets? What are the different kind of platforms that you're currently using that you would like to maybe share? I know some of us briefly explained about A/B testing. What do you do for A/B testing? Now with Snowflakes that kind of productize the pretty much data engineering and providing all this plug into BI tools and lakes, etc. Right? So just curious on what you guys are currently experiencing in terms of tool sets and infrastructure. One of the things that I could share is in my previous company, because with video streaming, there's shitload of data, right? It gets to a point, there's too much data that it becomes challenging to do anything with it. So you need to figure out real-time transformation, real-time warehousing and all of that. And we definitely went through a lot of challenges. Of course, with the tools that come out of box from Amazon, we use Kinesis. So peak loads are handled pretty well in there. And then we just read out of the Kinesis, dump it into S3 buckets. And then from S3 buckets, do a little bit of an ETL process to Hadoop Spark, and then dump it back into Redshift. And then the BI team can easily do some queries and read out of that. So I'm just curious in terms of data infrastructure, what do you guys have in place today? And are there some highlights that you want to maybe share?
For most of the use cases that was mentioned, like falling into this category of reduce your time to learning, right? So when you do this, a new product, you would like to minimize as much as possible your engineering efforts. So this concept of reduce time to learning, I would say the core for us is the tracking, right? So most of the products here, I think everybody in the engineering organization knows how important it's to have this core tracking feature that is foundation for A/B testing or testing the dummy test that Eric talked about. So to do all these things, I think to have an in-house capability, to have a lean, manageable tracking system, I think this is key. In our case, we made a conscious effort to keep this more homegrown tool where we have our events and user properties and so on, like the customer data platform is homegrown. We have it on AWS platform that was built with serverless technologies. But then the results or the insights that we get is more commoditized, where we use, for example, we use Amplitude for product analytics, where we send all of our tracking data to Amplitude to do this kind of A/B testing insights or product adoption insights and so on. At the same time, one of the reasons also to keep this core tracking in-house is we could use the same data to send to, for example, to your marketing platforms, so that your campaigns can be optimized, to your CRM platforms to customize your campaigns and so on. So this is the approach we took. So where we keep the core tracking platform in-house, but then all the edges is basically where we took us adopted the customer off-the-shelf products that is available in the market.
When you say ingrown and saying, how do you deal with Facebook? Is something solved server side as well? Because I think it's the biggest challenge you have today, how to track Facebook non-client side maybe, or
yeah,
something also solved.
Yeah, so for Facebook, for example, also provides you APIs for S2S. So where you can have centralized core events that you have, which you can then put it into their API endpoint. So Facebook, for example, has two SDK endpoints, one specifically for mobile-based campaign management. And then there is also one is called Pixel, which is more across the platform, where you can manage your S2S platforms. So what we do is we use the AWS Pinpoint, which is the event management for your apps that natively collects all the events, sends it to your, let's say, core system, from where you can taxonomically say, okay, I have 10 different events, but then now I normalize it to one event, which is like, click this button or open this video stream or read this book and so on. From there, your team's data engineering or BI data analytics team can manage this centralized taxonomy, and then you can send the same data to n different platforms. Facebook, Google, use also paid content like Taboola and Outbrain. We send it to Amplitude for our product managers to learn from it, or our content to improve the content quality, like are we producing the right content and so on. we do use also the same also for our BI platforms to do some analytics. Yeah.
There were some really good examples of tool sets. We pretty much use similar, right? I found Amplitude to be super, super powerful because the BI data that comes up from the warehouse in my previous company, the data engineering team took a bit of a time. It usually takes about 1 to 2 weeks before the data is cleaned up, structured, kept in the warehouse, and then become available for the BI guys. But from Amplitude, you can funnel it straight back into engineering, where the A/B testing can be done directly from the product development team, and they can see the funnels and all of that stuff. So I really appreciate it. And of course, we also use Tableau in the BI side, which we found very, very impressive.
For me, this is a really interesting topic because I'm actually right in the middle of setting this up right now, and I'm pulling a lot of from past experience how to do that. And so just give you a short idea so how I used to do this. We use Segment for this mostly, where we basically took all the sources that we have, like Google Analytics, internal events, Salesforce, we had Hotjar, New Relic, LogRocket, basically all these different systems, and we just all piped everything into Segment that basically pushed it into one giant database. And we then had a BI guy using Airflow and Bonobo. I don't know if you guys ever use that, to push that into a more readable format. Then we used Metabase basically for the BI guys, and Grafana for the dashboards for most of the people that just like sales and marketing. I'm now again faced with designing something like that, and the big thing I'm running into is basically the whole conversation about ETL versus ELT. I don't know if that's something that's come up with other people. Is instead of doing your transformations before you load your data, is basically leave your data as is and do your transformations in a much later stage in the project. To be fair, I'm having a hard time to convince people of the advantage of this, because for me it's mostly anecdotal. But what I learned from Segment is just while we were learning how to do our jobs, basically, because that's what happens a lot. We learn how to do our product and what's important for us, right? And while we do that, the whole process changes, like sometimes on a weekly basis. So you want to be able to go back to your original data, change that process, and how you're going to, how you transform that and how you present that. I don't know if that's something you guys have run into a lot, and how did you solve that?
I think we experience a lot of that, right? Like, when do you do the transformation? When do you we always struggle. So one of the things that we did in my previous work was to kind of distribute data in many different ways, right? So you have the data engineering, or where the data comes from, which it becomes just a lake, very unstructured, and everything is just everywhere. We make it available to anybody to access it from there. But at the same time, then the data engineering starts the transformation process, but it's not bottlenecking anybody. So we kind of open up the flexibility to internal and externally to everybody. And this was just learning. We didn't know what would be the best approach yet. So we kind of kept it in that way. But then the last part of it was a bit more like a secretive, the BI stuff, right? There was a lot of science put into that, and there was a lot of intellectual property in there that became a bit more closed up, and only the executive teams or the stakeholders get access to. So the thing, yeah, there were a lot of infighting too, right? Because when the data gets to the data team, they're not giving it easily away to everybody. So that's why I think intercepting it, because ideally the teams should have access to data so they can then decide what's the right thing to do.
My opinion, whenever you start touching something, whenever you change something, you already have created a new set of errors and bugs. And if you don't keep the original source, it's bugs that are very hard to track. So talking about the system, that the largest system I work with data-wise is this trading system I talked about. So we had about 1 billion requests a day, 3 to 4 terabytes of data that we handled each day. So it was a bit of scale. And we decided that we got requests from multiple different systems. They all had similar structure, but different structure. And we decided to keep always the very original raw data and never change it, because we didn't do that at the beginning, which was very convenient because everything looked the same and you had these nice translators and everything, the data was always nice, but then suddenly something didn't fit and you had no clue to figure out how, and you had to disassemble half the machine in order to figure out what went wrong. And that is just so much more painful. And the more you move along, the more difficult it becomes to track these kind of bugs. So one thing that we did, which I think is a very good hybrid solution, if you can afford the storage, and storage becomes even more cheaper all the time, is basically do both. So we added one field into the data structure that was like a translation of what we wanted, but we kept the raw data, and it meant duplicating things. But it was very clear that we had the fields where we want to read from, and we had the other fields for debugging. It sometimes meant that we doubled the amount of space we had, but since that was not the largest issue, storing data on, if you don't need it in memory, is not a big issue, and it saved us so much more time. And then the person hours that you need to debug are also not for free, right? So you have to balance that against the money you need for storage costs. So I'm not a big fan of transforming things before loading them. I would do it the other way around.
Just out of curiosity, Christian, do you also use some kind of data lineage tools? Because the problem that you mentioned is a classic case for data lineage, right? So you have the data transformed throughout, right? From the point you're starting to all the way till the end when it goes to some kind of BI solution or a data science model or something like that. So kind of like using a lineage system saves you a lot of time in terms of just debugging where exactly is going wrong.
That's absolutely true. The answer is no. A lot of things were quite homegrown, and the team we had when we built these things were not that experienced with these kind of things. So we learned a lot on the way, and a lot of things I would have done differently now, looking in hindsight. But the answer is no, we didn't.
Yeah, we've all been there. So no,
exactly. Yeah, no. Yeah, we learned a lot. Yeah, all of us. So.
I have a related question towards the data when it comes at the end to use it. So yes, we have the raw data, we have to transform it, analyze it, and then we maybe add even machine learning people on it, make some magic, right? We get a recommendation, and then we have to apply the recommendation. So we do this actually in order to ensure that our production is doing what we expect to do and keeping up with a lot of different users. So now the problem is you have machine learning people, you have data engineers, and you have those automation, maybe operations people. So who owns, so to say, the responsibility that the thing is correct, that you applied in production, and it adjusts its configuration of a production system, and it might go wrong, right? So what is your opinion on who owns the responsibility of the data? Because it's one brain is not enough to have it from the raw data analyzed, transformed, build out the recommendation, and then build the automation to apply it.
So this sort of connects to what I'm trying to deal with right now. I have to deal with a lot of DevOps, with a lot of data engineers, a lot of other people. I also have to deal with like 500 different sources of data right now, ranging from emails to big data sets. And what I'm trying to convince everybody of is that chaos is okay. You know, like it's fine. Because one of the things that you tend to do, and what all these people are trying to do, is they introduce a certain bias already really early in the process. And that sort of ties back to what I said earlier, is that you know, when you start focusing, you think you're right about something, you start focusing on that, so you start applying your own bias to it. But it happens in everything. It happens in science, happens in psychology, happens in programming. And what my task is right now is trying to convince everybody that it's fine that we have a giant pool of data that is completely unstructured, that nobody really owns, and then trying to apply structures to it eventually at some point. I'm struggling a little bit with it because I can do it with, you know, a small team. I'm okay with it, but trying to convince all these different, quite large groups that I have to deal with, that, you know, that mess is okay. And actually that's probably the best way we can deal with data, instead of, you know, transforming everything and putting it in nice columns. And then that is a bit of a challenge. But if you want my opinion, then I would say who owns it is just, you know, Google does this also, right? They also at some point gave up and said, no, we'll just have a chaos amount of data, and we'll just have teams trying to get it out when they need to get it out. It doesn't need to be clean. That's a little bit, that's my take on it. How to sell this within an organization, especially you know, the larger IT organizations, is that are used to having everything nicely packaged and nicely in columns. That turns out to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit more to what Ilan said. So what we are trying to achieve is moving away from this kind of centralized ownership towards more a distributed ownership model, where we say as producers, they are also the owners end to end. But then if you want to move towards this kind of a distributed model, then we need to apply exactly what Ilan was mentioning, the DevOps SRE principles to data, which creates the transparency that you want to see, right? As producers, they must be able to see how my data travels from A to B. And as long as data teams can provide this transparency, I think the ownership can still remain with the data producers, or can be distributed across the organization. And this is basically what we are trying to move towards. We are not there. This is this is fancy names now are being given, like data mesh and so on, for this this distributed ownership. But this is where we want to be there, where we could go into this model where we provide the transparency, how data flows through your landscape. Yeah.
I think it also depends always a bit on the stage, right? I remember now just Emboss, so I'm not in the data infrastructure. My previous two startups I founded, they were all in the data space, so we built those architectures and I had customers with the problems. But with Emboss, for example, interesting. Like when I joined, I mean, the data team was anyway just very small and just getting started up. But we went from back then, like we started out doing centralized just to get the infrastructure, the basics there, right? Data warehouse, things and so on. Then as we grew mature in the first phase, we went distributed again, like more like decentralized data. Now we're 3 years later of hypergrowth, like doubling every year. Now back in the stabilization phase, now actually back centralizing some of these things to call up with the growth that went everywhere, to then afterwards relax it probably again to go back, right? So I think it's this kind of like phases as your company develops, also quite common to change, not necessarily reflected in org structure, right? That's the second discussion, but just how you treat this problem. So we're right now actually 100% enforcing like things like with moving to a centralized schema. There's using segment protocols like an SDK style approach, where say if you introduce a new event, no matter if you just use it yourself, but it goes through a proper thing. So we can put some basics if we need it, because quickly hacked stuff suddenly becomes a key business metric, and you want to be able to have those things in place, right? So I think it's always kind of like interesting to see those shifts. This is my experience. Like you can't just say, oh, this is right, this is right. It maybe for the same companies, the same markets, the same everything, going from two extremes, swinging between it a bit. And also I think the most important thing, I can't argue more on what Ilan said. And for me, it's also like, I'm sure it's just me, but I think a lot of us, we're like very structured, this OCD on like, yeah, we have structure, everything clear. Data can be crap, can be messy. It's also fine to have shit data and delete it after things. And because in reality, I don't know, my experience at least, your key business metrics, you have anywhere in a database somewhere, like revenue stuff and so on. All this event stuff, have you actually looked back more than 90 days, more than 180 days, more than 360 days? So even if you fix stuff, it's, yeah, in 6 months, you're not going to talk about it anymore if you had a big fuck up or did something there.
I mean, I want to mention, because we are also talking about, gathering data at large scale and then pumping it and getting insights out of that. So I joined SumUp about 6 months back, and SumUp in the future, I work in the hardware division, so we make these, car terminals that I don't know if you are in Berlin, you must have seen it. And since the past 2 years, we are actually building our own proprietary terminals, completely built and designed in-house. And when I joined, the first thing I wanted to know, what kind of tracking do we do at the device level, the hardware? We wanted to understand how effective our battery charge holds and things like that, right? And the first thing I came up after my 1 month is like a draft of this data architecture. We have to, have these collectors in an IoT setup, distributed setup, and we need to push this data. We need to understand this. After a while, I realized that the nature of our business, which is payments, and the customers who are our customers are these small merchants, they completely depend on our device, right? And we realized that the most important data for us actually is this customer complaints. We don't need to care about collecting all this data, right? The customer will complain as soon as the charge doesn't hold or the transaction doesn't go through. What I'm trying to get at is that their data exists everywhere. And at times as engineers, we also bottleneck us by saying that, data is the way we collect this, and there's some data everywhere. And for us, yes, maybe at some point in time, we'll get to this distributed IoT setup, but right now it doesn't make sense. The priority is that if we do devices, customers, the nature of our business If they can't get payments, they will call us and let us know that things are going wrong, right? So it depends also on nature of business, something that I as an engineering owner also keep forgetting, just to give a different perspective.
I think that those are really, really valid points. And I think I can relate a lot to what Elmar was saying. It's an evolution, right, with data. The ownership actually changes over time. When there's only like, let's say 5 people in the company, it's complete anarchy. Everybody owns everything, right? So the only thing that we tell everyone is just store the data somewhere. Doesn't matter where, but just store it, because once the data is lost, it's hard to track back. Once it's there, we can spend money to go and analyze it and clean it up and do whatever. But I also believe as the company grows and evolves, at some point, it needs to have clear ownership, right? So that's when we were at the position where we had dedicated data engineering team. They mostly start with infrastructure. So I know we mentioned a little bit on the SRE concept. So usually it could be an extension of an SRE. They just provide the infrastructure where teams can at least send data to one location, like a lake, right? I mean, in an abstract concept, but still not clean. But as the company evolves further, then you would see some teams would start to do their own validation. They provide schemas to validate the data when they're sending or when they're receiving. So at least they can get notification. So what I've experienced is it's an evolution where data over time becomes less dirty. Your lake becomes a bit more cleaner, but it still hasn't come to the warehousing and transformation yet. So now you have different parts of the business hungry for data, right? The company has grown a little bit. It has maybe 50 people, maybe 10 million customers. Marketing wants data, product wants data to write campaigns, engineering wants data. So it just becomes crazy. Everybody starts arguing, where do we get data? But having this centralized team now can provide different plugins for different departments. All right, engineering, you want something? Here you go. Plug it out of the lake, do whatever you want to do with it. Maybe marketing, they can't do a lot independently. They would be like, all right, here's some data, we dump it into maybe, let's say, Redshift. Can you do SQL? Great, go and get it from there, or use some third-party tool. But the stakeholders wanted more cleaner data, they just have to wait. So then eventually we were in a position where we can afford a data science team. So it goes from data engineering, owning the infrastructure, owning the data, now data science team owns the modeling of it, when they do the modeling and everything, and then they provide it to stakeholders. So I think the ownership starts moving, but everybody will be hungry for data at some given point in time.
Also, I think what Gopi had mentioned, the way they move to data mesh, and what Elmer was also saying, I think this is something which I'm observing at OLX as well. Like in the early stages of OLX, it was all like a central data engineering team where you have all the reportings happening. And of course, as we evolved, as the number of experiments which we had to do increased, as the number of models we had to build increased, that central data engineering team just couldn't support, it just couldn't scale up. It also couldn't even provide tracking abilities to the whole product organization. So the next step which OLX is thinking about is literally the data mesh, that how can the data engineering team preserve some core functions like cataloging, tracking processes, like raw data, Hydra data tracking. So those things, they are still a part of the data engineering, how we are building some data warehouses. But a lot other things like analysis on respective functions, they are just outsourced to the respective product analytics, to the respective data science teams. What I sometimes see, and which is an open problem for us, is metrics, because everybody computes the same metric in so many ways. So how do we bring about alignment in those metrics? The definitions of those metrics also keep evolving across different teams. So do you have some insights that how have you standardized metrics in your organizations so that all the teams look at the same North Star?
That's a very good point. I think it kind of, you encapsulate a lot of things, right? This is the problem when we start to see at the scale, right? So we are scaling. How do we scale data? How do we scale using this data, right? So one of the things that I've experienced is we created concepts of pillars, right? So when the company is small, you kind of manage it, but once it gets to a point, the skill and creation of the pillars is based on the North Star that you've mentioned. So in a video streaming technology company, we have 3 different North Stars. One North Star is monthly active users. So we have monthly active users as a North Star, and that pillar now has to scale, not only from an engineering perspective, so it has its own marketing, campaign, business, developers, etc., all focusing on that one pillar. So the metric is kind of there. And then the second pillar was lifetime value, like how much time they spend on watching a content. That was another pillar with another set of group of cross-functional team, and everybody was focusing on that metric. And then the third one was what we call monetization, which then broke down into a couple of new pillars, which is one focus on conversion to pay, and the other one was ad revenue. So I think at some point when the company scales, I think it's important to have these pillars so that each pillar has its own North Star and they're all looking at the same metric, but it can easily be tricked, right? When you have the wrong North Star. So one of the things we learned, we had monthly active users as a North Star because everybody is rallying to that. Everybody decided to buy users. So your monthly active users just becomes really, really high, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing. So sometimes you need to couple of metrics together to get the right value. So I think that was one way of how, but we experienced exactly the same thing. We got to a point where when metrics are all over the place, it starts to not even align, and then you start selling the wrong story internally or even to the stakeholders or investors.
I would maybe combine here some statements. So I would say in the raw, so we keep the raw data, and then we get the data more and more aligned over the growth of the company. Yes, but then I actually like some kind of chaos, as we heard from Ian, when it comes to displaying the data in some matrix and dashboards, because then it comes, so we have some overview dashboards, they all the same, they have to be the same, right? So we talked about revenue, everybody should know the revenue of the company, but then when it comes down to really technical details, it is actually good that different engineers have different eyes on different things, and then this makes sometimes really a good analysis possible, because they correlate different matrix together. So there, actually, I love some kind of chaos when people try to connect different dots together. Nevertheless, the data is then in a good shape. I like it this way. Yeah.
Maybe one example from my previous company. So we had, we started, we were a travel company, and based on the amount of tickets that people booked, we gave different kind of sort of incentives. And we came up with this concept of a first-time user and a return user in the standard context. But on the BI side, the definition of this return user was not the easiest to calculate. So there was an ETL going on we used to look at, and we also had anonymous booking. So it was much more difficult to collect this metric. And we had to use this metric as a part of our in the code. So there was no way we could obviously run an ETL in a live real-time environment. The way we went about it is we did a lot of approximations when we did in code. We had a few data sources, we collected them and made a simple calculation by saying, okay, this is the way we calculate return, and this is how we calculate first-time users. This was very different than the way BI did it, but the sense was sort of similar. We saw that the distribution was similar when we were doing this. And eventually, once we rolled out this experiment, we saw it successful. That's when we went back and made a system out of it, right? Which could, pre-compute these things and give us this in a simple, fast API. So depending on how difficult this metric calculation is, sometimes it is just simple, right? Adding numbers and doing GVB or GMV is not difficult, but depending on the complexity of the metrics, at times it is okay to be different, as long as maybe the distributions are similar. And then maybe optimize it later if it really becomes a North Star metric. For North Star metrics, hopefully we have a central calculation which cannot be changed.
Have an interesting experience. Also, this sums up our discussion back to 360. There are certain areas or business functions where you can centralize these metrics, like revenues or campaigns and so on, where you can directly tangible to numbers. But coming back to the product side of things, we break them into products and features. and every feature has to be having some kind of a proxy metric that will correlate to this company metrics, right? And this is where we all the time get fooled by data, right? Where these proxy metrics not necessarily go back into your company metrics, and we get fooled by these proxy metrics. And this is quite common that, as Hizam was mentioning in the introduction, many times data fools us, but using the same data, we learn something new. Like, for example, how to build a habit in our subscription service, how to build the stickiness of the things. And this is the learning that we have always seen, that there are business functions where you can have tangible, clear, centralized metrics. There is going to be, especially on the product side, where you're going to experiment day in, day out. That cannot be one specific thing. Sometimes it will click, where you say, okay, you build something on your hypothesis and you create a proxy metric that could relate to this, but then you are bound to fail. And that's part of the learning journey that we go through.
So maybe as a question to that, is anyone, I mean, there's this ideal picture, right? You have this KPI tree, you say this is our company metric or revenue at the end of the day, and then it clusters down into, okay, these are the department levels, the product team level, and so on. You have this fully managed, fully 100% dependent automated KPI tree, and from everyone, from the person doing the accounting to the engineer writing the single line of code, knows how this pays to this thing, right? Is anyone following this model or is successful with this model? I mean, some ways pre-encoded in different orgs, but has anyone this as a primary construct and successfully implemented?
It wasn't like a switch that it happened on like immediately, right? It was a process that eventually we got there. But I found it super powerful to like almost enforce that. It's not natural for the engineering teams to care too much of the business process metric. By default, everybody would care about CPU usage, memory utilization, the stuff you may get from Grafana that you put it in, right? But I found it useful that when I start not caring too much about like outputs, but outcomes, it naturally forces everyone to look at this business process metrics. And then over time, you would see it starts to trickle back up to the top level metric, the business level metrics. But it depends on what exactly, like if you're looking at annual revenue or contract value, then of course the team don't really get to that level. But if it's like monthly active users, how many users churn out, it's actually much more beneficial when the team start looking at it. But when they start looking at it, you'll see it start building the tree by itself. And it's not very, very difficult at that point.
I actually spent years building a system like that for Purdue, one of the startups here in Berlin, where we tried to build an OKR system that went all the way from the lowest level up to the highest level, where basically, the engineer that increases his metric, like, active users or whatever, can actually see how that pushed the revenue for a certain month. So how much effect, his team or he personally had on high level metrics. And that was the whole point about that, making that pyramid and making it clear for people down, I would say down in the trenches, that what you do is important, because you're literally moving millions up top just by doing the right things down there. That really motivates people and also gives people a sense of ownership of the product. But that's, I would say, that would basically be in another complete another meeting to talk about OKRs and how to apply those to engineering teams, because that is not a simple subject, I found.
Ilan, I have a question, because this is exactly what we are trying to do in our company as well, build this kind of a metric tree. The challenge which we are facing is the relationship at different levels. Like, because of course, in some cases, when the relationships are very clear, like addition, multiplication, or mathematical relationship, it is much easier. But in cases, these relationships are not mathematical and we don't really know that how do we reach from step number 1 to step number 2, what is the factor? So how do you do that? Because for us, that's a challenge. Like, do we do experiments to figure it out? Do we look into historical data to find out that factor? Or do we look into past experiments done where we monitored a bunch of metrics to find out that factor? Do you have some ideas that how you implemented it in the past?
Yeah, the thing is, it is a mix of all the things you said, basically. And that is why implementing structure like that usually takes, we saw a minimal implementation time of about 6 months to a year to get something like this set up in a company, because it takes such a long time to understand all these processes. And sometimes there's just a Boolean switch, just being able to reach a certain KPI for about 70%. That usually is a good indicator that pushes the needle directly on another thing. And also, you can say if you have a top level KPI or goal, and that only has 3 pillars down, then those are the 3 pillars that are supporting it. And there's no real use to finding all kinds of external reasons. I mean, it is mainly the goal to make it clear to the people to downstairs, so you can make assumptions like that. But yeah, it is a hard process. I did it with Spotify, for example, and they spent 6 months trying to figure out, what are our KPIs, what drives us as a company, and that went up and down, left and right, and in the end, they basically threw everything out the window and started over, because they realized for a long time they were focusing on the wrong thing, and I found this myself as well. It's like you focus on a lot of assumptions, especially in startups, and then trying to mature that into a bigger company is challenging yourself on those assumptions, and then building these structures usually is a good indicator for that. Does it work or not? Can you make these lines between what happens at the bottom and what happens at the top?
I think it's also like I'm fortunate enough to experience it being successful and not being successful. Right? It can go wrong very, very quickly, because it requires a discipline, but it's super empowering for the teams. Usually the people who are the happiest are the engineers, but it's a cross-functional concept, right? You need to have all the different concepts for it to trickle up properly, so that the teams are using the data and they're not bounded to somebody giving them a list of features to go and develop. They're defining what they need to do based on the data that they have at hand, focusing very much on just achieving the North Star. And it may need collaboration in many different departments, right? So you could have a pillar that needs, let's say, 10 engineers, a couple of marketing folks, a couple of sales folks, and all of them need to figure that out to make it work. But as the company scales, it also helps to break down that North Star into many, many different North Stars. So it becomes a bit more distributed and chewable.
I think it's also important to keep in mind there's also 2 separate things, right? Like one is outcomes versus output. So that's more like what mentality or what principles and values do you apply in your engineering organization? And the other one is how to pace things together, right? I think the question, in my experience at least, the question is asking people to think about this, right? Is to say this bottom-up approach, to say how can I contribute to the company goals, is the main thing you want to get out of it. And usually it honestly said there's a lot of creative interpretation in this level. Sometimes like, how does your DevOps team, right, or your platform team contribute to this? Sure, there are implied metrics like time to market and so on, but I think it's kind of like just asking the question and making sure, hey, what are you doing to impact those company goals? Does 90% of the job, even if then there's a very far stretched kind of thing via proxy metrics to get there. So for me, it's mostly about the journey and the discussion in most of these cases versus the actual one-on-one connection between those things.
The other challenge that I face in applying that model is everybody wants to provide a suggestion, because it becomes an empowering team, because the goal is outcome. So now everybody is empowered. Okay, what can we do to achieve that outcome? So we found the challenges. We have to come with a lightweight process. Okay, guys, everyone, you throw an idea. So we'll collect these ideas. Let's say we get about 50 ideas. Then we go to a voting process. Okay, everybody gets 100 points, votes. And then the top 10 of that, okay, execute it for 2 weeks. If in 2 weeks you can prove that what you have done moves the needle towards the top level North Star, then we continue with that idea. Otherwise, that idea gets canned, and then the next set of ideas gets executed. So it empowered everybody, regardless if you are product manager, engineer, business developer, marketer, whatever it is. Everybody just goes. It's beautiful when things are working, but it can also become very ugly very quickly.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that, because actually Purdue was featured in the Gründerzene in Berlin with an article that basically said that this software could be used to weed out departments that had no use for the company. So that was the ugly side of OPR. We were not very happy, but I mean, it gave us a lot of bad publicity, but yeah, publicity anyway. But yeah, so sometimes people are scared of this a little bit, that, you know, if it clearly shows that this department does not do anything, you know, to move the needle for the company, then how do you deal with that?
That is a pretty valid thing, right? Like it's when you make it requires maturity, right? It depends. Like I've experienced it in many different companies where the maturities are slightly different. When it becomes completely empowering, outcome driven, like you said, it highlights maybe people, teams, department that are less valuable.
Thank you very much, Hizam, for facilitating that. I think it was very lively, and yeah, thank you all for attending.